All right, I want to welcome everybody to the Charlotte area SharePoint user group June 2023 meetup. My name's Andy. I'm going to be your host and presenter here today, and we're going to be talking about transform your Microsoft 365 messages with Power Automate. So we got some people joining us live on Microsoft Teams. We've got some people that are joining us live on YouTube. So we're in a few different places. This is going to be kind of fun. Behind the scenes setup. I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm actually feeding through OBS and sending the stream two different directions. I'm sending it to Microsoft Teams and to YouTube simultaneously. So we're going to see how this turns out. If you're attending here live, feel free to ask questions in Teams if you're in Teams, and ask questions on YouTube if you're in YouTube. And we're just going to see how this goes. This is a little bit newer setup, so hopefully the audio and video are coming through loud and clear. So with that, you got a few more people popping into the chat window. So we're here today to talk about Power Automate. But first, since you're here, let me tell you a little bit about the Charlotte area SharePoint user group. I'm one of the organizers, been a part of this group since like 2014, but the group's been around since like 2010. We're a old school user group, but we do more than just SharePoint. We do all Microsoft 365 and Power Platform. So Teams, OneDrive, Viva Engage, SharePoint, Power Apps, Power Automate, and pretty much everything in between. Those are the topics that we typically talk about monthly. So a little bit more about us. You can reach us on a number of different channels. We are on Twitter. We are on Meetup. It's actually really easy to find on Meetup. It's casug.org. That is casug.org. You'll also find us on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and just look for Charlotte area SharePoint user group. I manage all the social media channels along with a couple of my colleagues. We're pretty active on there, so feel free to reach out to us and engage with us in those communities. But you can also engage with us on YouTube. So we have our live streams pretty much each month, and we do record those and make those available on our YouTube channel. So that's bit.ly/CASUGYT. It's super simple, but feel free to follow us on YouTube, subscribe, and we got a pretty active community over there. We're getting close to 1,000 members in the YouTube channel, which is pretty cool, especially because we don't really promote it a whole lot outside of these monthly meetings. So it's pretty nice, and our content tends to be long form. We're talking like an hour and a half for some content. And we get a lot of people kind of popping in and hanging out with us there. So that's really neat to see that grow organically. But we're here today to talk about Power Automate. So with no further ado, let me just exit out of here and Power Automate. So this one is talking about transforming your Microsoft 365 messages with Power Automate. So what are we talking about here specifically? We're talking about email actions. We're talking about connecting with people in Microsoft Teams, connecting with people through Yammer/Viva Engage. How can we simplify our messaging efforts across all of those different channels? And what are some of the things that we can do when we start to do that? So just basic, I'm just going to go in and just create an instant cloud flow so we can kind of kick this off and start the conversation. So going in, when we start working with actions, there are actually a lot of actions that allow us to do things like maybe email users, for instance, if I can spell email correctly. So for example, you've got the Office 365 Outlook email actions, you've got the email action, and then there's a number of other services that provide some email-based actions as well. There's also an Outlook email action, which is separate than Office 365 because this one might be connected to like an enterprise account, like an E3 or an E5 account. But using the email actions is one of the core ways that we can communicate with a group of people using Power Automate. And there's a number of things that we can do with that. For example, somebody submits a file or an item to a SharePoint list. We can use this as a way to start a notification process, maybe notify somebody that something's been updated or changed. We have that out of the box as well. That's an alert, but we get to customize the message if we're using the email action. So it's core to communication if you're trying to track new items or things that maybe have been modified, but also if you're looking to interact with files, especially in like the SharePoint world, and that's where I come from, so that's kind of my background. So we can use the email actions around this And there's some cool things that we can do with that. I'm not going to go into the basics here, but some of the things that I think that are really helpful with the email actions are the dynamic lookups. So we have the ability, we can specify people, but we can also use dynamic lookups. And depending on the information that we may have collected previously, we would be able to do dynamic lookups from that content. And we can use that as a way to communicate with people. So that's pretty core. Also, through the dynamic lookups, we're going to be able to go in and specify subjects and the body of the message, and we can dynamically look up that information. So again, that's kind of core, and that's not really what I want to cover here. What I want to talk about is how we can utilize this more effectively if we're dealing with things like multiple people, groups of people, SharePoint groups, Microsoft 365 groups, Microsoft Teams. So I want to talk about how we can communicate with large numbers of people, and then we're going to extend the conversation over into Viva Engage / Yammer and even Microsoft Teams and talk about some of the things that we can do there. So drafting a message, pretty straightforward, but getting it to the right people and some of the tips and tricks there, that's really what I want to talk about here today. So first things first, let's say I want to send an email, but I want to send it to maybe a group inside of a SharePoint site. So I've got a bunch of like pre-built flows that we'll kind of navigate through as we're going through here because I want to save some time. But let's say I have a SharePoint site, a Microsoft team, a Microsoft 365 group, and I want to work with emailing and communicating with those teammates. So just kind of going through it, let's say I manually trigger a flow here, and then I want to send an email. Well, I could add an action in between, and there's a number of different actions that I can work with. And just high level, let's just look at the word groups. So you're going to see a couple of different things pop up. Right away, I notice Microsoft Teams. It's in the center. It's purple. I also see Office 365 groups, and I see Office 365 mail groups. So I could technically use one of these as a way to communicate. But I'm specifically interested in maybe SharePoint groups because that's the world I come from. So what about SharePoint groups? So I'm looking for SharePoint groups, and I don't see anything specific to SharePoint group membership. So how would I get like the SharePoint group membership for a site and maybe use that as a communication? Like it's easy enough for me to get it, to get the communication if it's something that maybe was created by someone. So like, for example, I could add the get items here and I could tell it what site I want to point at. So maybe I've got a site that I want to work with. I could tell it the list that I want to work with. And then once I've selected like the get items, then I would be able to use that information down here. So for example, I could go and say, well, from the dynamic content in the to field, get items, and maybe find the created by email, the person that created that item, use that as the communication. Now, in this case, it dropped it into a loop because we're getting items. We're probably getting more than one. It's going to filter through that, loop through that many different times. That would be an array. So it goes ahead and drops that into an apply to each for me. But in this scenario, it would send an email to each item that was created and to the person that actually created it. So just kind of baselining off of that, that's one way that we can communicate. Like we're connecting to a list. We're telling it this is the list we want to look at, and then based off of that, do the dynamic lookup and find maybe the person that was created by, or perhaps find the email field associated with that. Now, if we go and actually look at the list, and I actually built this out so you can see it. Let me find the list. Here we go. So this is the list I'm looking at. Now, this list here has fields, including an email field inside of here. So I got like the first name, and then we move over. There's actually emails in here, but I didn't reference the email field that's part of the list. I actually referenced who created the item, who created the list item. That's who I'm going to actually be emailing, and not the email field. So if we wanted to use that, we would need to switch it up. So let me actually just blow this up and delete it. We'll head back, and then we'll say from the contacts list. Then we can go in, and we'll do our Outlook 365 email. So we'll send an email and then specify in the to field. This time, notice there's the the email field. So this is the system created ones, and this is the one that's actually in my list. And because it is a list and we're getting a bunch of items out of it, it's going to go ahead and drop that into a loop once again. And then it'll iterate through that array, and it'll send an email to every single person that's inside of there. So we're going to build sequentially. What if that's not the desired outcome? What if I don't want to send, let's see, how many items were in that list? Let's actually go back and look at that. That list actually has 77 items. Sorry, it's kind of hidden behind me a little bit. That list has 77 items inside of it. So that would potentially send 77 emails. That might not be my desired function. So let's actually work on that. What can we do? So we'll blow this up once again. All right, so how can we manage that? How can we manage, in this case, a scenario where we have 77 items, but we want to maybe narrow it down to just perhaps a few. So one of the things that we can do that's actually really helpful is before we even start to do the email, like we've got our get items function here. What we can do is we can initialize a variable, and then we could take advantage of the fact that this is an array. And based off of the fact that it's an array, we can actually create a string of values, and we could use that in the to field and send one email, or we could CC or even BCC it. So for example, I'll go in here, we'll add an action prior to the get items, and I'm looking for a variable. One day we will learn how to type. So we're actually going to initialize a variable. I'm going to give it a name. So in this case, we're going to call this our contacts list. I'm going to make this a string, and then I've got my items here, but I would actually need to append to that string so that we can get all of the names of the people that we're actually interested in. And this was an unintended consequence, but I think it's actually really kind of fun that we're actually seeing the comments from the Teams chat showing over here as I'm doing this live. So keep them coming. That's kind of neat. All right. So with that, I'm going to go in. I'm going to initialize a variable. I'm going to get items from here, and then the next step is just to append to a string. And what we want to do is we want to take the values that are actually coming out of this and append that to a string. So we would go in. We're going to be working with variable again. And then we can go through, append to our string variable, and then we can tell it exactly what we want. So we're going to append to the previous variable that we're in the process of creating. We're going to get items, and we're going to tell it the value that we want that's coming out of that. And so if you see, if I go through here, because we got items, I should be able to loop through, and like there's the created by field, I could reference that, or the modified by field, the user that actually created it, or I could scroll down, there's the email field. And because that is a array, get items, it's a list of things, it's an array, it's a table, then it's going to loop through that automatically. The only thing I need to do is separate that out with like a semicolon, and I should be able to get the values that I want. So we'll save this and we'll actually test it. I need to give it a better name. All right. So it's telling me that I should use OData to filter. I'm not above any thresholds that I would need to worry about that. So let's actually test it, and let's see if we can view like what the outcome of this is going to look like. So we'll go ahead and run that. And it's looping through. As it's actually doing that, we can verify. We can also check out the output. So this is like the raw information that it's actually going to be pulling, and this is all JSON. This is the array of information, but I should be able to go in there. You can see like there's Allison Brown. I should see Megan Bowen. There'll be a number of different names that are going to show up inside of there. So heading back into the flow, this is actually done. I should be able to go and append to the string, and we'll see, and you see, should be pulling out some names from there. And if we just cycle through, see each one. So ran 77 times. And then if we were to go back to our workflow and then go back into our Outlook actions, now we can send an email and we can use the output of this append to string. So like, for example, I could go into the to field here, dynamic, and I've got that variable that I created. And so I can use that as a way to email those users. Or if I don't want everybody's name to show up in it, I could do like a CCC, or I could do a BCC with all of that, that information, and then use that as a way to send that out. So that gets us around the scenario where we want to iterate through something, grab all the values that are there, and then based off of that, in this case, send an email. But we don't want to send 77 separate emails. Maybe we just want to send one email and perhaps have something like 77 names in there. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and test this with my email. So 1 second. Should be easier. Give me my email address. There we go. And in a moment, hopefully an email will come through and I'll should see some of the results there. Oops. All right. And email has already come through for me. So let's actually go and check that. And it looks like there's a few users that accounts are not active, but the email was sent and we're moving along. All right, so that's how we get started with some of this. So in this case, we're basically doing an email blast, but using the variable and then using the loop to apply to each and append to that. Now we know a way that's a little bit smarter to send this out versus sending 77 emails. We can send a single email for multiple people. Now, moving off of that, let's actually head back to our flows. Let's talk about the next scenario. I come from the SharePoint world, and one of the things we used in SharePoint were SharePoint groups. And using SharePoint groups, it was actually easy with SharePoint Designer workflows to send an email to the group. It was an action. It was super simple. But as we saw, there's not SharePoint groups that are immediately available inside of Power Automate. But it is possible to use a SharePoint group as a method to send communications. And there's some advantages to that. As the membership of the site changes, people come and go, we can just use the SharePoint group and not have to update our workflow as much. We reference the group and then we can send our communications to that group moving forward. Saves us some time and energy. And we just allow the site owner maybe to manage the site, and then by managing the membership, the group is automatically referenced. So let's take a look at an example and how we can actually do that. Now, I'm going to show you an action that's going to scare some people, but it's actually not that crazy when you get into it. So we're going to send an email, but we're going to base it off of an HTTP request to SharePoint. Now, there are multiple HTTP requests that are available in Power Automate. Some are premium, some are not. This one is not. So using the HTTP request to SharePoint, we can actually get the members of a SharePoint group and then find the properties for that SharePoint group and send that group a communication. So here's how this would actually work. So we're going to use the send an HTTP request. We tell it the site to connect to, and the method is get. That's all really straightforward. The magic is actually right here. this is the thing that we actually need. And for those that are joining in Teams, I will send that over. But this is actually the little magic that we need. We need to do _API web site groups, get by name, and then in parentheses with a single quote, the name of the SharePoint group that we want / users. So how do we get to the name of the group? Well, navigate to the site, go through your site's permissions. And in my case, I want to go to advanced permission settings. And what I'm looking for is the name of a SharePoint group. And these are the 3 groups that I have. So which group do I want to message? Well, if I want to message the visitors, this is the group. And this is the name that I need to reference as part of that URL. So I would take that, I would append my URL, again, API, _API, website, site groups, and we can zoom in a little bit for the video in order to see that. There you go. I'm going to put the name of that, again, between a set of single quotes and in parentheses, and then in that with a users. Now, that's going to get me an array of all the users that are actually there. The next step, though, is I need to actually move through that. I need to select something inside of that that is meaningful. This is the part that gets a little bit tricky. So I'm going to use a select action for this. Now, using select, I'm going to go into the from field, and I'm not going to be able to do a dynamic lookup. It's not going to give me what I want. I'm going to actually work with an expression, and the expression that I'm going to be pulling from actually looks like this. So it's going to be based off of the body. So it's the body send from send an HTTP request, and we're looking for the results. And again, for those joining in live, that's in the chat window. All right, so that's going to allow me to get the body of the results. So what that means is go and get an array of this, and then I need to map it to email. All right, so when you look at the select key initially, it's going to be, there's 2 different edit modes. We need to click on the switch map over here and get it to the single entry. And then I'm going to be able to reference the email. But again, if I go into the dynamic lookup, it's not going to give me what I'm looking for. I'm not going to see the dynamic lookup value. So what I actually have to do is, once again, a little bit of a formula. And based off of that, what we're actually looking at here for this particular value is items email. And you could actually start to type that out. So for example, you could say I'm looking for item, and then you could append to that. But basically this is what you're going to be looking for is item, open close parentheses, your question mark, squared brackets, single quotes, email. And again, those that are joining live, we'll put that in the chat. And then once we send that, we can actually test this. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to test this, and I'll show you what the output's actually going to be. So we'll go ahead and run that. That is done. Flow ran successfully. So if I go here into the send an HTTP request, I can see the outputs, and just a glance moving through here, it's going to tell me what it actually pulled back. There's Diego. Scroll through, I should see a few other names. There's Henrietta. So it's actually giving me back what I'm looking for, Linda Halloway, and I can go back to the site and I can actually verify that. So if we go back to the permissions, I was looking for my visitors group, Diego, Henrietta, Linda, Megan Bowen, and Patty Fernandez. So I should have 5 values inside of that. I can also output to the JSON, and I can verify that that is in fact, there's Diego. We can move through and find all the names, Linda and so forth, or Lydia. And then if I go and I look at the select here, it'll show me the body, and look at that. There's the 5 email addresses for the people that I wanted. So it's not so scary. It took a little bit of some copy paste. But I provided that in the chat window, and I'll provide a blog that kind of helped me to understand some of this from a Microsoft MVP. As Will says, yeah, you could also parse the JSON as an alternative to go through that. Absolutely. I like this one. This one's a little simple, but yeah, parsing the JSON, totally. If that's something that you're familiar with, absolutely. You could parse JSON and do the same thing and look for the email. All right, so that gives us our SharePoint group. And then it's just a matter of going down here. And similar situation from before. So if we want to communicate with all the members of the SharePoint group, it's just a matter of sending an email. And same thing would apply from before. We could pick the field that we want to work with. We might be able to do dynamic content, but because this is being outputted from an array, and we've got the select option, we would want to append a variable in between, kind of similar to what we did in the previous step. Append a variable like a string variable based off of that select action, and maybe use that as the communication for the next piece. So that's how we can use a SharePoint group. It is possible with a little bit of HTTP request magic. All right, so that's the next scenario. Now, let's continue up the ladder a little bit. Actually, yeah, let me just exit out of there. All right, so continuing up the ladder, we've done the individual users associated with a list. Now we've done a SharePoint site, but in the Microsoft world, the next step up is actually going to deal with Microsoft 365 groups. So I've got one for group members, and we'll walk through this and some of the things that you can actually do with it. So fortunately for us, there is an action specifically that allows us to list group members. So we saw this just a moment ago. So if we go in, I'll just add an action in between here, and we're going to say we're looking for groups. So there's the Office 365 groups, and yes, I believe somebody put in the comments, it should say Microsoft 365 groups. They need to update that. And then you've also got Microsoft Teams. We'll build up to Teams in a minute. So I'm going to use the Microsoft 365 groups action, and if you look into that, it's going to show you the list group members. Now you can also list all groups. So if you wanted to narrow down maybe across a couple of groups and then list members, you could absolutely do that. But we're just going to list the group members. That's all we need for this particular action. So I've actually already done that. The only thing you need is the group ID. So I've already got the group ID. I did some testing on this earlier. I'll clear it out. This is what it looks like by default. So it does show you the name of many of the groups that you have. So it is possible for you to look through that. And there are some advanced options. But I'm going to actually do a custom value, and I'm going to use that specific group ID. Now, if you are looking for a specific group ID, one of your friends to actually do that is actually going to be your admin portals. So for example, if I go into portal.azure.com, I can go into Azure Active Directory, and then I can select groups. That's going to show me a lot of the groups that I actually have, and then it's just a matter of scrolling through until I find the group that I want to work with. So in this case, maybe I want the Power Users Champions group that's here, and so this is the group ID associated with that. So I can copy that value, and this is a demo tenant, so it'll be okay. So I can copy that value, and then from there, it's just a matter of pasting that in, and then we'll just save that. I'll run a quick test on it, and I'll run that as a flow. All right. So moving through, and you can see that it went pretty quick. And if I scroll through here, it's going to show me a number of values. It's going to show me what it was able to pull back. I see student 9, student 8, I see Grady. So if I wanted to verify that, here's a helpful trick to actually do that. You could go back to the group itself. So for example, I could go to Azure Active Directory. You could drill down into that, and you can see there are 7 total members. There are 2 owners associated with that particular group. And I could verify that with the JSON. But here's what I like to do when I'm outputting members. If I have an idea of how many that are there, or if I want to know specifically how many were actually returned, I run a compose action. And with the compose action, I'm actually going to do a simple formula. And the formula that I'm looking for is actually super simple. And what I'm doing is a length. And the length is going to be based off of an output. So if I were to create this from scratch, here's what it would actually look like. So let's add an action. We'll do compose. There's a data operation. All right, and then from here, we're doing expression. And come on, hold on. Trying to get the editor to work with me there. And so I'm looking for length, and then I'm going to go and we're looking for our body, and we say okay. And what the formula actually ends up looking like, and I'll add this as a note here as well, and I'll paste this into the chat window, and we'll zoom in a little bit. But basically it's length, output, list group members, body value. That's what we're looking for in that particular action. So when we do that, when we save it, and we test and run that again, output 7. There were 7 members that were associated with that group, and now I've got my group members. So I know that I'm actually connecting to the right group. Now that I've done that, and I'm getting the actual group members, it's just a matter of using that in one of my comms. So for example, we would be able to, let me see here, take this group like we did before, and we're going to edit, add an action. I'm going to drop a variable in. All right, so I'm going to initialize a variable here. We'll call this our group members. This is going to be a string. We're going to list the group members. I'm still going to run the compose because I just want to make sure that I'm getting everything out of this that I need. And then we're going to run a new variable down here. So a variable, and we're going to append to a string variable, reference the one that we just created. And then the value that we're actually looking for here is going to come from the list group members. So we're just going to scroll through. There's the value that I'm looking for. It should drop. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm looking for mail because I need the email address. That was dynamic. I don't have to parse the JSON or anything. This one actually gives me the email. So when I say mail, it drops that into a loop, and it's going to iterate through that array because it's an array of users, and then I can use that as the output for my next communication. So we'll just test that. And it's going to take a moment to go through, but it should show me 7 here. That's going to move pretty quick. And then append to string value, ran through. You can see, grabbed the names for those users. So now I got the names that I want to work with. And it's a string variable. So just like we did before, we could drop in an email action, insert the output of the variable to the to field, the CCC, or the BCC field. All right, so that's another way that we can communicate. In this particular instance, now we're going from a SharePoint group to a Microsoft 365 group, but we have the advantage of if we manage that Microsoft 365 group. So like, for example, if we've got the permissions here, and this particular site that I'm working with, these are SharePoint groups, but there are also Microsoft 365 groups that are associated with it. This is a modern team site. So now I can message the members of this particular group and use that as part of my communication. So I have options, how I want to communicate. And by maintaining the group membership, it's dynamic. The site owner, the group owner actually manages that. And then my flow would be able to communicate with that. All right, so now let's go one step further. So kind of moving up that ladder a little bit more. So we've done the group members and the SharePoint members. We could also append that to like a Microsoft team. So we could use a similar scenario for a Microsoft team. Because if we actually look at a team, for example, here's the team that site's built on. We manage the membership of the team here. We have owners and members and guests. We manage the membership of the team here, 7 people. It's based off of a Microsoft 365 group. That's what's actually nested in the permissions over here. So we go into the site permissions. So we could leverage that in a couple of interesting ways. So for example, maybe we want to schedule a channel meeting and we want to have that channel meeting go to everybody that's a member of the team. Referencing the group that's associated with that can make that possible. All right. Let me close this window, bounce it back and forth between screens. And looks like we got a comment coming in. I'm going to let that pop up and then we'll continue. I like the chat. Yeah, so Will's pointing out in the comments that if you create a Microsoft Teams site, so if you create like a Microsoft team, the SharePoint site is automatically created, and as part of creating the team and the site, the SharePoint groups are created automatically, and the Microsoft 365 groups are also created automatically. So if you create a Microsoft team, you get all of those things all at the same time. And now you know how to pick and choose your own adventure for some of the notifications around that. All right, so taking some of what we've learned now, we can work with a list of people, we can work with a SharePoint group, we can work with a Microsoft 365 group, and by extension, we can work with a Microsoft team. Now we have a few different avenues that we can use for some of our comms and some of our communications. So the next thing I want to dive into are some of the really cool things that we can start to do with some of that information and some of what we can actually start to build. So let's head back into Power Automate. And so for this next part, we're going to do a new flow, and I'm just going to do an instant cloud flow. I've been doing instant cloud flows the whole time. This is great for testing, but you could do this for a selected item. You could do this when something new is created or something is modified. You could also do this automatically. There's a few different ways with that. I like doing manual triggers to begin the testing process. All right, so what we're going to work with here are communicating across multiple channels. So next up, let's say that we don't want to work just with like email, for instance. Let's say that we want to email and supplement and work with our users in another place. And one of the places that we can communicate, depending on whether your organization has it turned on or not, is Viva Engage, formerly known as Yammer, also known as Yammer. This is a recent name change. So Viva Engage allows us to create communities. And communities are a group of people that it's either public or private within your organization, but it's a community. It's a group of people that can have discussions, ask questions, share information. You can also have things like town halls, and you can have some live event presentations that happen inside of there. But a community is basically like a forum for collaboration. And it has one advantage that Teams doesn't have. Teams is a workspace, but you have a cap for the number of people that can participate in a team. It's 25,000 is the limit, I think, as of June 2023. So what if your organization has 100,000 users? Or what if you're even bigger than that? Viva Engage is a great way to create a destination for people to be able to work, to have open conversation. It's not a workspace, it's a place for conversation, a forum. So we create communities in there, and we can use Power Automate to actually go into Viva Engage and do things like post messages. So we just need to sign in to the Viva Engage service. Probably should have tested this before I did this. Hold on one second. I will be right back. Got to go off screen for a second. Pro tip, make sure you set up your demo community before you get into the demo. I can't show you that action, so what I'm gonna do is show you a version of this that you could work with. There's more than one way to get to this information. All right. All right, screenshot will work in this instance. So we are going to create an action in our Viva Engage community. And when we create a message here, we get to define where that message is going to live. So we get to pick the group ID that's associated with that community. And that's going to be the specific community. So we have our Viva Engage instance. This will be a community inside of there. So we might have multiple. From there, we can generate a message, the message text. Now, this allows us to communicate to everybody that's a member of that community. But here's the rub. See, this one has HTML in it. You can use Markdown inside of one of these messages to communicate. To place emphasis on something like bold, to have line breaks and organize that content. But you're only able to do that if you are broadcasting. And what broadcast actually means in this instance is in that community, you're making an announcement. So you have to have permissions in order to make an announcement in order to do this. Otherwise, for a normal discussion or question, Markdown is not supported. Now, if we're doing an announcement, also know that there's going to be an email communication that might go out with that. So anybody that's a member of the community can subscribe to the community emails. And I think they do that by default, but they can unsubscribe from the community emails and they might not receive it. So if we think this through logically, if we post an announcement to a Viva Engage community, it will supplement that with an email communication, and that's yet another way that we can reach our users. But in this context, not only do they get an email, they also get the message inside of the community, they get the notification in the community, and they can respond to that maybe through the replies that are actually built into the community. So that's a way that we can broadcast a message across yet another channel. So in this particular instance, not only can we do Markdown, but we also be able to do text, and you can reference variables, and that's where it gets really fun. So like, for example, you could go in to your editor, and you could actually use a compose action. And before we even get to this particular section, we could go in and start to compose the message that we want. And we can do some really cool things inside of here. So we can drop in HTML. And we can do, like, I'm going to say, like, I'm looking for the body. And don't worry, if you're not proficient in this, there are some text string to Markdown editors that you can use that'll convert some of that for you automatically. So I'm just entering in some of this, just typing it in manually. But notice as I'm doing this, the dynamic editor pops up, and depending on what information that I have available from the previous actions, I would actually be able to call that as part of my as part of my message. So maybe instead of string, I meant to say strong. That's going to place emphasis on this, and then we could go in, close that out, and we could continue with this and build this out. Now that we've composed this, though, we can actually recall it down below. So we initialize a variable and we pass it down into the Yammer community. Messed up and didn't test this connector before the demo started, but I will post a video with that on my YouTube channel. All right, that's going to allow us to communicate to Viva Engage, but that's not all. We can also post to another location, and maybe we post to Microsoft Teams. And in Teams, we can create a chat, but we also have the ability to post a message in a chat or in a channel. So we can use that as a way to extend that reach even to yet another location for the team that needs it. So in this case, we can post as a Flowbot, we can post as the user, and they also have the ability to post as a Power Virtual Agent. So I'm going to post maybe as the user. I want people to know that Andy posted this, but if you did the Flowbot, it would be the Flowbot service. Then we just have to tell it where we want to post. And in this case, maybe I want to post in a channel that my team is actually working with. And if we're thinking about the membership associated with this, we have owners and members and guests in the team powered by Microsoft 365 group. Depending on the notifications, they might receive a Teams notification and they might receive an email on the back end of that. From there, it's just a matter of selecting the corresponding team that we want to connect to, picking the channel for that team, and then we can start drafting the message. Now we have a message formatter here, but it does allow us to work with Markdown, and it allows us to do things like compose actions. So we compose this thing up here. We could actually drop that into this message. Now, if we're putting on our thinking cap, we compose the message one time, and now we've used it in two separate channels, and those channels might also be supplemented by email. So we're really starting to branch out now and reach people wherever they may be. And drafting the content up here would be advantageous because if we make any changes here, it could push out those changes to multiple locations. It can help us to reference that content in both places. And if you're wondering, does the Teams channel post, does it support Markdown? Yeah, it supports Markdown as well. And if we extend this one more parallel action, we could also go in with Outlook 365 and send an email there, and we could reference the output there as well. So now we can really start to use this smartly in a few different places. And if we apply some of the lessons that we learned from earlier, we can go in and we can say, like, for example, we'll do variable. So we're going to initialize a variable. We'll call this our group members. I'm going to do this as a string. Then from there, I'll add an action. So now we're able to go in and I'm going to say groups. I'll just do an Office 365 group and iterate through that. So list the group members. I just have to give it the corresponding group ID that I want it to work with. And actually, it needs to be a custom value. There we go. All right, so we've given it that ID, and so we would just walk back through some of the steps from earlier, which once we do the group membership, then we need to append to the string. So we'll add an action, variable, and append to a string variable. Tell it what we're looking for. We're going to drop in the email values from this particular group. It's going to output that as an array for me, so I can use that if I want to go down here and maybe use the dynamic content and use the group members and email them. But I'm tying in the compose action for the body of the message that I want to use. I'm using the same message in 2 separate channels, or in this case, like 3 separate locations, and I'm just amplifying my communication, amplifying my reach. And I'm just looking at the comments in the chat window. All right, so that's what I wanted to cover here this month. I apologize about the Viva Engage snafu there. I will test my connections prior to the next demo. I was in my Andy tenant, and then I switched over to my demo tenant to run this. So I'll get that one on my YouTube channel. But this is just a preview of some of the things that we can do with transforming our communication. Now we see how we can work with a whole bunch of people. Now we can see how we can work with a number of different groups, whether it's a SharePoint group, a Microsoft 365 group, or a Microsoft team. And we've seen how we can use the compose actions to format a message that can be reused in a couple of places. Just keep in mind with Viva Engage, it has to be an announcement, and that will potentially push out an email with that. So shameless plug, while I've got you all here and your attention, this talk was actually born from another conversation that I was having with a good friend and colleague of mine, John Moore, and we're actually going to be doing a 365 deep dive tomorrow on something closely related to this topic. In our 365 deep dive on Friday, June 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be talking about how to create a subscription button for Stream Video. How does that apply to what we've talked to here today? With the Stream service built into Stream on SharePoint, how do you get notifications to users that there are new videos available, like for a playlist or for maybe a site that you're working on? We're going to show you a couple of different methods for an easy, a medium, and a hard method to set up a subscription service. Maybe you want to use a SharePoint list and give users a button to subscribe and unsubscribe from that list. Maybe you want to do something dynamic, like use membership to a SharePoint communication site. Or maybe you want to do something a little bit more dynamic, like a Microsoft team or Microsoft 365 connected group. Maybe you want to work with a Yammer Viva Engage community for some of that membership. Now that we've gotten some of the core foundation of how we can work with Power Automate and connecting users through messages, we're going to show you how to use things like Microsoft Lists and SharePoint sites and Teams to create a subscription service for your Stream Video stuff. So check that out. It's on our 365 deep dive. That's going to be hosted on John's YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the chat window, and I'll put a link in the description here for the user group. But with that, I thank you all for being here today, kind of walking along with me on this one. This was fun to put together, fun to think about, and I hope you got something interesting out of it. I'm going to stick around for just a couple more minutes for any additional questions, but otherwise, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do so, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks, everybody.